All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar this morning. This is a webinar called People, Places, and Pfas, How a Long-Lasting Chemical Impacts Wisconsin Communities. I'm Karina Heim. I coordinate the Coastal Training Program at the Lakes Pier National Estuarine Research Reserve. And I just wanted to start us off by saying that when we asked coastal professionals in a survey recently about what topics they needed and wanted more information about, emerging contaminants really rose to the top of the list, even higher than other water quality concerns like road salt and plastics pollution and algal blooms. And so I just wanted to start by saying, PFAS are this class of chemicals that are created by people that don't break down under natural conditions. And as we're detecting their presence and persistence in the environment, we're still learning a lot about them and about their impacts. But as concern about PFAS has increased, so has PFAS research and study. And so the webinar today, this morning, is meant to be an introduction to what we do know about PFAS chemicals and their relationship to human and environmental health in Wisconsin. And our panel speakers today can bring the perspective of what this work to better understand and regulate PFAS looks like from a Wisconsin agency perspective. So today's presentation should hopefully give us all a sense of the state of the knowledge on PFAS and the direction that PFAS research is going in. And I appreciate all of our panelists being here, and I will introduce them as they come on this morning. Just a little orientation to our Zoom protocols today. To make this as webinar-like as possible, I'm going to ask that folks, while our panelists are sharing, keep their videos and their microphones turned off if you can. There will be dedicated time after each of our panelists share. Hopefully we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for some questions, some Q&A. And so I'll ask that folks hold their questions until that time. You can put them in the chat as we go, but more likely to see them and gather them up at the more towards the end of the webinar. So, but we do welcome your questions at the end. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first panelist here. Get Gavin pulled up on the screen for everyone. So Gavin Dehnert is an emerging contaminant scientist with Wisconsin Sea Grant at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's explored the impacts of toxicants on freshwater fish. He recently did a postdoc fellowship with the Department of Health Services, helping set Pfos groundwater standards. And I'm going to turn it over to Gavin to give us an introduction to this topic.
Thank you for that. And good morning, everyone. My name is Gavin Dehnert, and today we're going to be learning a little bit about PFAS. And PFAS, these are those per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. What I'm going to do is just give kind of a quick, brief overview about what are these chemicals, just so we can kind of get a footing, or kind of help us understand what this emerging contaminant is. Then I'll be passing it along to a couple other of my colleagues to talk a little bit about some of the health effects, as well as some of the health effects on our environment. So I always start to think about PFAS is if you go into Google right now, and if you just Google PFAS, you're going to see a lot of news pop up. You even 19 hours ago, 2 hours ago, different articles are constantly being shown about this. But what are these? What are these forever chemicals that exist? You know, there's stuff talking about it being in our animals, stuff in the water, the air, it's all over the place. So how do we really start to understand these chemicals? So PFAS, these are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, better known as PFAS. You'll hear me talk a lot about these different acronyms, but PFAS is referring to the whole grand scheme of these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And they're a family of man-made chemicals. And what's interesting about them is there are approximately more than 5,000 of these different chemicals. What's really hard, though, is scientists themselves can't even really come down to the exact number. Some people say there's more than 9,000. Some people say there's more than 4,000. So there's this range of 4,000 to 9,000 plus chemicals, and it's really kind of how we're defining them. And these PFAS, they are in a lot of different things. And we'll learn a little bit more about where they are, but really these PFAS are on kind of anything that can be heat resistant, water resistant, or kind of oil resistant, etc. So they're really in a lot of different things. And the most well-known different PFAS that are out there, this is PFOA and PFOS. So a lot of research has actually gone into these two substances themselves. I threw up the chemical structure here, not that you need to know it, but it's just kind of good to get an idea of what they look like. What's interesting about both of these two chemicals is they've actually been phased out in the United States. So we no longer produce either two of these chemicals directly. They are still being used on different parts of the world, but at least in the US, we don't use these anymore. In what's replaced them, though, is we have some new PFAS chemicals. And you'll notice now, we have Genex here and Adana. And you notice they have slightly different chemical structures. And what those chemical structures are helping out with is decreasing how long they last in the environment, which I'll talk about in a second. So all of these PFAS, they can be found in groundwater, they can be found in drinking water, they've been found in the soil, they've been found in air. And so they're kind of ubiquitous into a lot of different areas around the country and the world. And what's important about them is these PFAS, they are very persistent in the environment and in the human and animal bodies. So they last a very long time. And a way to kind of understand this is we can think about them as a half-life. So the famous one that I had mentioned is PFOA, P-F-O-A. And this has a very long half-life of about 8 years in the environment, a little bit more, a little bit less. And what the half-life means is we can think about it as we have 4 water bottles of this contaminant. 8 years from now, we'll have approximately 2 water bottles left. Another 8 years can go by, so we're at 16 years, and we're down to just 1 water bottle. So it takes 16 years for us to get down to about a quarter amount of PFAS or PFOA that we started with. And so when you think about when PFOA and PFOS were really created in the 30s and the 40s, we are likely seeing the same PFAS that had already existed from back then. So it lasts a very long time. And what complicates it even more, and again, I don't expect us to kind of know any of this, but once it breaks down, it's breaking down into a bunch of different ones. Each one of these can have longer half-lives. So you can start to see how these different PFAS can really last in our environment for long periods of time. In PFAS, it's found in many different sites around both Wisconsin and the United States. And this is a map that kind of shows all of the known PFAS sites throughout the US. And this is, I believe, from 2021. And there's over 2,800 sites that have known PFAS contamination. And two states that I like to always point out is you can see we have Michigan that has quite a bit, and North Carolina that has quite a bit of PFAS contamination. Part of the reason Michigan has quite a bit is they were one of the states that really pioneered the testing for it. So we could really see a lot of it. And then in North Carolina, this was a state where there was a lot of the manufacturing of these PFAS going on. But what we're really here to talk about is the state of Wisconsin. And so if you take a step back in time to, I believe this is 2018 of December, there were really, let's say, 8 to 9 known sites of PFAS, and they were pretty well correlated to air bases or places where they produce this. Now, if you fast forward to 2022, in February 11th of 2022, you can see the number of contamination sites we have a lot more contamination sites. And especially here when we're talking about where we are, you can see there's even a contamination site up in the Lake Superior area. And what's the most important to think about when you're thinking about PFAS is they can be found not only in our air, our soil, our ground, our groundwater, etc., is they can also be found in plants, animals, and humans. And they are not really indiscriminate, or they're really indiscriminate of where they're getting into. So we know we found them particularly in the Lake Superior area. They've been found in rainbow smelt, which we'll learn a little bit about later, I believe. They've been found pretty heavily in bald eagle nestlings. So that's an important one up in that area. They've also been found in top predators like the wolf, but as well as some of our plants like wild rice, which are very important to that area. And of course, we also know they've been in humans, which again, we'll learn about later. And with that little quick introduction about what the contaminants are, I'm going to pass it back to Karina, and next we'll hear from Lily.
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. Thanks for getting us started with that sort of baseline understanding of PFAS, where we can find them, and getting us thinking about some of the health and environmental impacts, which we're going to transition now to Lily. And Lily, I just want to let you know we're not seeing your slideshow yet. We're seeing your, there you go. We got it. And let me get you pulled up here. Great. Okay, thanks. Okay, so we're now going to start thinking about, we're going to hear a little bit about PFAS effects on health from Amarilys Gonzalez Vasquez, otherwise known as Lily, who is a toxicology fellow in the Department of Health Services in Madison, Wisconsin. Part of Lily's work in the department involves collaborating with other toxicologists in recommending standards and values for safe drinking water in Wisconsin. So with our next portion here, we're going to hear from Lily about PFAS effects on human health and what DHS is doing to protect us. Lily, go for it.
Hi, so thanks, Karina, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Lily Gonzalez, and as Karina mentioned, I will be presenting on the health risks of PFAS and what the Department of Health Services, or DHS, is doing to protect its citizens from these contaminants. So as Gavin mentioned, what are PFAS? We previously heard from Gavin's presentation that PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and they are a family of man-made chemicals that contain carbon, fluorine, and they can also contain other elements. So just to give more of a brief overview of what Gavin presented, PFAS have been mainly characterized by a chain of carbon atoms. So as you see here, and these carbon atoms are usually bonded to fluorine atoms, as shown here. And what's interesting is that some of these also have a functional group, which could either be a carboxylic acid or a sulfonic acid functional group at the end of the chain. And so what's really important to know about PFAS is that not all of them contain the same functional groups. So not all of them have carboxylic acid or sulfonic acid groups. There are newer PFAS that are different. But overall, these structures are pretty much the basis of the different chemical properties and the behavior of these different types of PFAS. In general, as well as what Gavin had mentioned, there are nearly 5,000 types of PFAS, and some of them have been more widely used and studied than others. And the first PFAS that were created was in the late 1930s, and they've been used in different types of products as ingredients, such as in nonstick and waterproof coatings. But the most common use of PFAS have been in aqueous film forming foams, which are also better known as firefighting foams. But PFAS have also been used as ingredients in fast food wrappers or grease-resistant papers, such as those that we see in restaurants. And they've also been seen to be used in water-resistant clothing. Another way that PFAS have also been used is in nonstick cookware. So what's really important about PFAS, and the reason that they're so highly used, is because they have shown the capability of being resistant to grease, oil, water, and heat. So how can we be exposed to PFAS? Well, people can be exposed through several ways. The first, I guess, example of how we can be exposed to PFAS is through food. So food that's been packaged in PFAS containing materials, or food that's been processed with equipment that use PFAS, or if it's food that's been grown in PFAS contaminated soil or water. So this means that PFAS can be found in living organisms, as Gavin mentioned, and this can include fish and other animals that are consumed by humans. Another way that we can be exposed to PFAS is through commercial household products. Examples include stain-resistant products in fabric and carpet. And then we can also find PFAS in our drinking water, which has been a major concern, especially because potential exposures of PFAS have often been associated with historical contamination of surface and groundwater. So a little bit more information, kind of like what Gavin had mentioned. There's PFAS contamination sites that have been open in Wisconsin. So there are more than 70 open PFAS contamination sites, which are represented by these yellow dots. And these are known PFAS sites in Wisconsin as of February 2022, so pretty recently. So why do we care about PFAS? They're everywhere, they're ubiquitous, there are a lot of them, and we can be exposed to them. So why is this important? Well, studies among people have shown that high levels of PFAS can cause negative health effects. And some of these health effects, when we become exposed to high levels of PFAS, include examples such as high or increased cholesterol levels. We can also have a reduction in antibody response to vaccines. And then other studies have shown that high levels of PFAS can decrease fertility in women. But that's not all. In addition to these health effects, PFAS can also increase the risk of other diseases, such as thyroid diseases, osteoarthritis, ulcerative colitis, and even different types of cancers. So as further studies on PFAS become available, we still continue to learn more about the health effects of these contaminants. Now, the next big question is, if PFAS are everywhere and there are a lot of them and they cause a lot of negative health effects, then what is the state of Wisconsin doing to protect its citizens from these contaminants? Well, specifically, the Department of Health Services, or DHS, works to protect the health and safety of Wisconsinites from conventional and emerging contaminants, such as PFAS. And the way that the state does this is in a variety of ways. One of the ways that the state is protecting you from PFAS is through the development of groundwater standards. More specifically, DHS develops groundwater health advisories and standards for substances, and this includes PFAS. And the reason that the development of these health advisories and standards for groundwater is so important is because 2/3 of Wisconsin residents use groundwater as their drinking water source. So just to give a little bit more information on how these groundwater standards are developed, it all begins with the Department of Natural Resources, or the DNR, where they first identify substances of concern So an example, Pfas. And once these substances have been identified, DHS is then responsible for developing recommended standards. And finally, DNR then promulgates those standards. So in terms of developing these standards and health advisories, most of these human health standards are based on actual toxicology studies that are conducted in research animals. So currently, DHS has developed recommended groundwater standards for 18 PFAS. And the way that we do this, and the reason we do this, is to evaluate potential health risks in communities. So for example, DHS has been able to work with various communities that have shown to be contaminated with PFAS. And some of these communities include Wausau, Eau Claire, and Red Mountain. Another way that the state is protecting you from PFAS is through the development of fish consumption advisories. So you can be exposed to PFAS by consuming fish. So fish consumption advisories, they come in as warnings for people when fish are unsafe to eat. So an example is if fish are contaminated with PFAS or if they're contaminated with mercury, then these advisories are issued when humans face potential health threats from eating the fish. And as we know already, PFAS can persist in fish for long periods and they bioaccumulate, meaning that older fish are likely to have higher concentrations of PFAS. And this is concerning because consumption of fish that contain these elevated levels of PFAS is a potential human health concern. So one of the things that we do to limit the amount of exposure of these contaminants is that the DNR sets fish consumption guidelines, and they base this off of scientific literature on how much fish meals a person should eat in a month, week, or year. Now, in most areas in Wisconsin, following the statewide fish advisory can reduce PFAS exposure, but there are other bodies of water that can have specific advice to reduce exposure to PFAS. And lastly, the other way that the state protects you from PFAS is through the site evaluation program. The purpose of the site evaluation program is actually to evaluate chemical spills and contaminated sites across the state of Wisconsin. And so to do this, they conduct health risk assessments at known and potential contamination sites. So these are sites such as the one that we had referenced earlier from this map. In addition, the site evaluation program is also involved in addressing community health concerns. They are also involved in recommending actions to stop or reduce unhealthy exposures at ongoing chemical contamination sites. And this program also supports the EPA, DNR, local health departments, and communities on various chemical contamination sites across the state of Wisconsin. So this is what the state can do to protect you from these contaminants. But in addition to that, there are also several ways that you can also take action to reduce PFAS exposure. So some of these actions can include vacuuming and dusting regularly to reduce dust. Of course, following Wisconsin's fish consumption advisories, and rinsing off after swimming and avoiding contact with foam. Avoiding using PFAS impacted water for drinking or preparing beverages and even foods that take up a lot of water. And also avoiding using PFAS impacted or contaminated water for watering produce. In summary, what we learned today, people can be exposed to PFAS through drinking water. Not all PFAS are the same. PFAS can cause health effects in people. And the state is working to protect you from PFAS through the development of groundwater standards, fish consumption advisories, and the site evaluation program. So this is all I have for you today. Thank you all for your attention. I also included some more information and resources on PFAS if you are interested. So thank you.
Thank you, Lily. I really appreciate that overview, and especially that how those standards are developed. That was something that folks who registered for this webinar were very curious about. So thanks for giving us some insight into that, and really appreciate that. Okay. All right, I'm going to transition us now to our, to our third panelist here, who is Sean Strom from the Department of Natural Resources. And Sean, I'm not able to spotlight you up here, but we'll turn it over to you in just a second. So Sean has earned a BS in environmental science and environmental science and biology from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and a master's in environmental toxicology from Colorado State University. Sean has been with Wisconsin DNR for over 20 years, serving as a toxicologist in both the wildlife management and fisheries management programs. He has studied both legacy and emerging contaminants in a wide variety of species, including fish, bald eagles, water birds, songbirds, waterfowl, fur bearers, and small mammals. I feel like that about covers all of them. Sean's going to share with us now a little bit more about PFAS effects on ecological health and what the DNR is doing to protect us. Sean, turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Karina. There we go. So I'm going to kind of divide my talk up today in kind of two halves. The first half, I'll talk about PFAS and Wisconsin fish, and then I'll kind of finish by talking about PFAS and wildlife from Wisconsin. So the fish contaminants monitoring program in the DNR has been in existence now for about 50 years. Every year we go and sample fish from anywhere between 25 to 100 sites. The primary contaminants that we are concerned about right now, mercury and PCB still top of the list. There are a few others, chlorinated pesticides, which are primarily concerned in the Great Lakes, which those levels have been greatly decreasing over the last decade or so. Dioxins or furans, which are in a small kind of select species in specific water bodies, and also emerging contaminants. And of course, PFAS is one of these growing contaminants and has become one of our priorities within the contaminants monitoring program. So I'm not going to really go over the health impacts since Lily did such a great job. The one kind of bullet that I want to point out is the very last one, and that PFAS tends to accumulate in muscle tissue. And the reason why that is important is that there's for fish, there is no way to prepare or cook a fish that will decrease the level of PFAS. Some contaminants like PCBs, you can clean the fat away, you can cook it in a certain way that will decrease exposure. That is not the case for PFAS. It's in the muscle tissue, so there's really nothing that can be done to decrease the levels. So this is a graph statewide of PFOS, so PFOS, which is a specific PFAS in fish from across the state. And we focus on PFOS because this is believed to be the most toxic and most bioaccumulative of all the PFAS compounds. And so all consumption advisories are based on levels of PFOS. So if you just take note of the species on the far right, so the highest levels in rainbow smelt, crappie, white bass, bluegill, and then contrast that with levels that we see in mercury. And so in mercury, again, on the far right, we see muskie, bass, walleye, northern pike, lake trout. And so for mercury, these are what we refer to as top level predator species, large, long-lived fish that eat other fish. And so for mercury contaminants like mercury and PCBs, we always see the highest levels in these top predator species. And that's just not the case with PFAS, where you can certainly get high levels in these predator species, but we also see high levels in what we refer to as like panfish species. So crappie, white bass, bluegill, perch, things like that. And we simply don't know the reason why. The accumulation patterns are much different, and we're still trying to figure out possible reasons as to why these species that we always considered more safe when dealing with some of these legacy contaminants cannot follow the exact same rules as it really when we're dealing with PFAS. So I'm just gonna kind of look at Lake Superior specifically. So Lake Superior is on a regular rotating basis in terms of collecting and analyzing fish. The last time we did a comprehensive survey was in 2019, and we collected a wide range of species from across Wisconsin waters of Lake Superior. And I have rainbow smelt there highlighted, and that's going to kind of be the focus is what I'm going to talk about. So these are the PFOS or PFOS levels in Lake Superior fish. So levels were relatively low in most of the species except for rainbow smelt. And so rainbow smelt, we had very high levels to the point where they were in the 1 meal per month category. Lake whitefish were in the 1 meal per week category, but there was already an existing advisory in place for Lake Superior whitefish due to PCBs. And so these were the locations where these rainbow smelt were collected back in 2019. So there's some that were collected kind of off of Port Wing, Wisconsin, and then others from the Apostle Islands. And the levels did not show any sort of a pattern in terms of location as it relates to the concentration. They were elevated regardless of location. And we get a lot of questions about, well, what about the St. Louis River? Could that be a potential source? Well, we did collect fish from the St. Louis River. And the PFAS levels, again, in all the species were relatively low. Yellow perch just kind of came in right above the 1 meal per week level. But there's already a 1 meal per week advisory for yellow perch from the St. Louis River. And so a new advisory was not needed. So PFAS in smelt. So the previous advice for Lake Superior smelt was unrestricted for all age groups. And this was kind of unique since we did not have that level of advice from many species or many areas throughout the state. This was one of the few species in areas where there was literally no consumption advisory. And so the fact that this new advisory was for 1 meal per month was fairly significant. Interestingly, high levels were also observed in Lake Michigan smelt. This was from a study that was conducted back in the mid 2010s. But there was already an advisory for smelt from Lake Michigan due to PCBs. And so, an advisory wasn't needed. The question is why smelt? And simply, we don't know. Michigan just yesterday released some information regarding their own sampling. When we issued our smelt advisory, they kind of followed suit, but then also did their own sampling, and their smelt PFAS results were kind of in line with ours. And so they also have a 1 meal per month advisory for smelt. So future plans, we have not been able to identify any specific source. We have done some additional sampling of Lake Superior and Lake Michigan smelt. We do not have those results back and probably won't for another 6 to 9 months at minimum. And we do plan another lake-wide survey of Lake Superior next year, so 2023. Get asked about, what about the toxicity to fish themselves? Most of the toxicity is based on 2 specific PFAS compounds, Pfos and or PFOA. In general, fish seem relatively tolerant to most PFAS compounds. Field investigations with effects are limited. There's some suggestions that there may be some behavioral impacts, but many of those are from a laboratory setting. But right now, currently, the primary concern is for consumers of fish both humans and wildlife. So now I'm going to kind of switch over to what we know about PFAS in Wisconsin wildlife. And specifically, you're going to talk about, actually back up a little bit. What do we know about the toxicity of PFAS in wildlife? There's several endpoints that have been identified. We still don't know a lot. We're still learning, each and every day. But the current data suggests that there's some endocrine effects, specifically thyroid function, some reproductive effects with hatching success, immunotoxicity, and also there's some that believe that there is some behavioral impacts that can be tied to PFAS exposure. So I'm going to talk about the Wisconsin Bald Eagle BioSentinel program. This is a program that uses nestling bald eagles to assess trends in environmental contaminants. Different regions are sampled on a rotating basis, and we analyze these samples for a long laundry list of different contaminants, both legacy and emerging contaminants. We collect plasma, whole blood, and feathers. And the purpose is that it provides a snapshot of contaminant exposure in Wisconsin wildlife, which can be useful for multiple different programs within our agency. So these are the populations that we have sampled between 2011 and 2017. We have not sampled since 2017 just due to some organizational and agency restructuring, but we will be restarting the sampling again this year in 2022. So this graph represents the total PFAS levels, so all the different PFAS compounds added together. And there is a very distinct pattern where the Wisconsin River, both the middle part of the river, which we consider from about Wausau down to the dam at Prairie du Sac, and then the lower Wisconsin State Riverway, much higher levels compared to other parts of Wisconsin, including Fox River, Green Bay, and in our control area, which is the Northern Highlands forests in Oneida and Vilas counties. I did add some data from the Apostle Islands and the south shore of Lake Superior, and these data were taken from a paper published by Cheryl Dykstra and Bill Rowdy from the National Park Service, where they followed the same sampling protocols as we do, so the data is very comparable. And what they found is that the Lake Superior total PFAS levels were kind of similar with what we observed in the Fox River, Green Bay area, as well as Lake Michigan. Now, kind of dial it down a little bit to look at PFOS. This is considered to be one of the more toxic compounds. Right now, the proposed avian toxic benchmark is at about 1 part per million or 1,000 parts per billion. And none of our populations reached that level. The middle and lower, again, Wisconsin River populations have the highest level. And I will say there were individuals within those populations where their individual levels approached that toxic benchmark. So while the population is probably not experiencing toxic impacts, that doesn't rule out that individuals might be. And again, I'll point out the Apostle Island and Lake Superior South Shore data, again, fairly low and kind of comparable with our other Great Lakes data. So there's been some talk lately about whether or not we're kind of looking in the wrong place in terms of what's considered most toxic. I had mentioned that PFOS was considered, and some still do consider, but there's others that say, well, there's other PFAS compounds that might be more toxic to wildlife. And the three that have been tossed around are PFDA, PFDOA, and PFU, and so kind of a acronym soup. And the results are kind of up and down. They follow the same general pattern where the Wisconsin River has the highest level. The interesting thing, though, is that if you see the Apostle Island and Lake Superior South Shore have much higher levels of PFUNA compared to the other populations that have been sampled. We really don't know why. A specific source has not been identified. And again, we're not exactly sure of any impacts. But as I mentioned, there are some that believe that these compounds may create some adverse behavioral impacts in birds. So I'm going to just talk real briefly about white-tailed deer because it's been in the news a lot the last few years. There's a PFAS contaminated site in Northeast Wisconsin. There's some concern regarding the possible contamination of wildlife, specifically deer. So in 2020, we collected muscle, heart, and liver samples from 20 deer from this contaminated site. We observed low levels and non-detects in both muscle and heart tissue. However, in the liver tissue, we observed fairly high levels of Pfos. And again, if you remember from earlier in my talk, Pfos is the compound that's used to derive wildlife or consumption advisories. So as a result of these levels, we did issue a consumption advisory for white-tailed deer liver. So even though no consumption advisory was needed for muscle or heart, we did recommend a do not eat liver from deer harvested within a 5-mile radius of this JCI TICO facility near Marinette. The 5-mile radius was estimated to be the maximum travel dispersal range for deer. It's probably overly generous. You probably don't wander that much, but we just wanted to be safe. And at the time, this was consistent with the methodology that Michigan was using because they had deer consumption advisory for one of their contaminated sites as well. And the liver advisory was kind of a combination of not only the levels of PFAS, but then also just a reflection that the liver is a detoxification organ. And so it contained high levels of other compounds other than just PFAS. So we did do some additional deer sampling, and the purpose was to better understand the levels of PFAS in deer liver throughout Wisconsin. So we recruited 80 volunteer hunters, which were all DNR staff, and samples were collected during the 2020 9-day gun deer season in late November. So we collected a total of 52 samples. 32 were submitted for analysis. That represented 1 sample per county, and PFOS was not detected in any of these samples. And there was actually only 1 sample from Columbia County that had a couple very low detections of some different PFAS compounds, but nothing that would suggest a consumption advisory. So just to summarize things, on the fish end of it, PFAS is now included in regular fish contaminants monitoring. We have expanded sampling in known problem areas. As I mentioned with both during the bald eagle discussion, is that the Wisconsin River is kind of a big focus area right now. We are examining accumulation patterns. There's a group called the Great Lakes Consortium, which all of the Great Lakes states in the province of Ontario, where we discuss and share data and come up with kind of best practices regarding fish consumption advisories. So we're trying to figure out some of the unique accumulation patterns related to PFAS. And we work with the Department of Health Services to issue new consumption advisories as needed. On the wildlife end, PFAS was detected in every bald eagle population sampled. While most of the populations are below current thresholds, the PFAS levels, there are some individuals that are above. White-tailed deer muscle is likely not a significant source for hunters or consumers of venison. And we are actually considering waterfowl sampling, and that will probably begin next year in 2023. So I know I went really, really fast, but I'd be happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, so much for sharing all of that information about accumulation in fish and wildlife. And gosh, that's very interesting about the mercury accumulation and PFAS accumulation observations in fish being so different. Folks are familiar with mercury up here around the St. Louis River. be interesting to solve that mystery, hopefully. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Gavin once more to give us just a little bit of information about where the future of PFAS research is headed, to take us out here. And this would be a very good time, if you've been holding on to your questions, to think about them and put them in the chat, because we will have some time to answer some of those questions at the end. And these can be questions for any of our panelists here. So start thinking about and typing those questions. I'm going to get Gavin's video pulled up here and turn it over to you once more. Thanks, Gavin.
Yeah, and it was a couple great kind of talks from both Lily and Sean, and I'll try to move through the current research and where we're going as fast as we can, so we can get to some questions. So as I probably forgot to mention, I work for Wisconsin Sea Grant, and part of what we did this last year is we put together a giant workshop that brought these state agencies like the DNR, DHS, StatCap together, so we can, together with the academics at different colleges around the state of Wisconsin, to kind of put together like an actionable science plan for PFAS. And what we really kind of came up with was 4 different categories of which we were going to, that we could push this PFAS research forward. The big one that we looked at, or the first one we're going to talk about, is environmental contamination. And so this really had a lot to do with learning about where is the PFAS going and how is it getting there? And then, you know, kind of some emphasis here on the plant and animal transportation. Another really big one that they looked at was exposure pathways. And this was to kind of look at kind of how are humans being exposed to different PFAS. Like we know it's in different, we know it's in soil and water and food, etc. But are we seeing differences in if there's mixtures of these chemicals? And then also, are we seeing any inequities when it comes to exposure of these PFAS? The third really big one that we were looking at is waste, biosolids, and remediation. So really kind of figuring out how well are we able to contain PFAS? How can we get rid of it once we know it's in the environment? And then a big one is like, how are we handling this waste? Right now, there's maybe not the best ways that we're doing it yet. So we want to really increase our research to know how to handle PFAS moving forward. And the fourth big one that I'll just throw out was about toxicology and epidemiology. This kind of goes back to the human side. So there's both that human toxicology and the environmental toxicology that Shauna just talked about. But just in the same manner of the animal side, there's a lot of research right now that's going into the toxicology for human health impacts, to look at both mixtures and all these different chemicals, because right now each of the PFAS are looked at individually. So potentially, how are these mixtures adding to this combination? And we flew through these really fast, but you know, as part of our questions, we can always explore them again. And so from here on out, we can kind of jump back into our questions.
Okay. Thanks, Gavin. If I could ask all of our panelists, if you're able to turn your videos back on, I can get your videos pulled up here. We do have some questions that have come in from folks, and I just want to remind folks that for the remainder of the hour, we can take some time for Q&A with our panelists here. There you go, Lily, I've got you pulled up here too. Okay, so I'm just looking to the chat now. A couple questions from Sue. I think a lot of folks around here were curious, what is the PFAS site in the Superior area? Are you, is that something that was shown on the map? Is that something you can share or is known?
It's definitely known. I'm not sure of the exact name of it. Sean might know exactly, but it's in Superior area, and it was due to, I think, from a fire from a while ago, a couple of years ago or something like that. I don't know the exact name. I apologize.
The fire at the refinery, probably.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I just wanted to make sure I had the right information. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Sue. Lots of good questions here. John mentioned that he heard that there will be a drinking water standard for PFAS compounds, but no enforceable groundwater standards. He just wanted to check if that's the understanding of the panelists as well.
I can answer that. So yes, you are correct. When the DNR had recommended or asked the DHS to establish these recommended groundwater standards, they were not enforceable. So initially for PFOA and PFOS, the DHS had established enforcement standards for 20 parts per trillion, but it did not pass through. So currently they are serving as health advisories and not as enforceable standards. But in the next, I guess in the next year, we will be also working, as I mentioned, with 18 other PFAS and developing groundwater standards for those. And then we will see if they are approved, or if not, then they'll also become health advisories.
So who's they that needs to approve it?
The legislature.
Yeah, okay, got it. Thanks.
I also I wanted to highlight, John had another question, and I wanted to highlight it because it also came up in the questions that you all asked when you registered for this webinar. John asked, are there processes or resources to help identify highly vulnerable communities? And I'll pair that with a question that another person asked, are there funds out there to do investigative sampling for PFAS that can be accessed?
I don't know if somebody else wants to answer this, but I can answer, I guess, in terms of if there's any efforts into testing or sampling PFAS. So the DNR received funding from the EPA. And so they have what is called a voluntary sampling or voluntary testing for PFAS. So if there are any communities that want to sample their community wells for PFAS, they can do so. All they have to do is email the DNR. I can provide the email on the chat. And it's completely voluntary.
Yeah, Lily, if you're able to pop that into the chat, that would be great. I'll let other panelists respond if they want as well to that question about resources available and sampling funds.
I know there's a lot of research that's going into trying to figure out where the PFAS are being found. You know, if you're near a contaminated, a known contaminated site that has a responsible party, there usually is extra funds to do some of that as well. But we're still in the learning and finding where it all is phase.
Yeah. There was a question about whether fishing line could be a possible source of PFAS contaminants. Is that something anyone can speak to?
To be 100% honest, I don't even know if it has ever even been looked at yet. You know, to be 100%, not that I haven't heard anything where fluorocarbon line could be a source. If it was, you know, I think, and Lily, you can probably chime in, but dermal exposure would probably be fairly limited. So unless if you're eating it, it's probably not a huge concern. But yeah, I'll defer to Lily to further explain maybe.
Could you repeat the question? I was
putting something in the chat. Yeah. So the question was about whether there's about fishing line and whether it could be a possible source, if we know anything about that.
If there can be a possible source
from fishing line of PFAS.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure. I'm well aware with the fish consumption advisories, but other than that, that was something that I'll have to look further into.
Yeah. I might move to another. Oh, go ahead, Lily.
Oh, sorry. I was just looking at the messages, but you can go ahead, Karina.
Well, I was going to pivot to another good question about that a lot of people asked about removal and remediation. And so Sam's asking what technologies are the most promising for PFAS removal. He threw some out there that I don't know anything about, carbon filters and foam fractionation. Can you all speak to that? Maybe people are looking for some hope.
So I can just throw this out there, and we're probably, the three of us are probably the least understanding when it comes to the actual remediation processes that are the new technology that's coming out. I do know there is a lot of research that's going into it, and there are actual ways to take it out of the water. I know at the moment they are quite expensive, and that's kind of the easiest way I can explain it is there's really good technology. It's starting to kind of continue to progress, but at the time, it's the big one. There's a remediation process going on that's being implemented at the JCI Tyco plant in the Northeast Wisconsin that Sean had mentioned. So there is some technology that's able to do it, but once it's taken out of the system, we still have the problems of how are we going to try to break it down or contain it when we put it into other things. So there's research going into it, but still learning.
I can follow up on what Gavin mentioned with DHS in terms of us trying to protect you from getting exposed to PFAS through drinking water. We do provide fact sheets that I can also include on the chat, but mainly when it comes to filtering out the PFAS from drinking water, we suggest using granulated activated or granular activated carbon or reverse osmosis. And there are other ways that you can reduce your exposure to PFAS in terms of drinking water. So I'll just go ahead and add that as well on the chat.
Thanks. And I think sort of related question, just curious about whether municipal wastewater treatment facilities are monitoring for these chemicals. I know we have at least someone in the audience who might be able to answer that question, but do you all know?
Sam from WLSSD.
You're the one, Sam.
Oh, okay. Well, I was thinking, I thought you meant me and Lisa because she's in Wisconsin and I'm in Minnesota. Minnesota just yesterday came out with the PFAS remediation plan, monitoring plan. So now that is going to be something that WLSSD is one of like 390 in the state of Minnesota that have been identified to start with monitoring. I think there is some concern about how it's going to get paid for and that sort of thing. Yeah, super complex issue. It's mostly wastewater plants and landfills and then some industrial places that take care of that sort of thing. So I think we're kind of on the forefront of that. I know Wisconsin's pretty close behind Minnesota, maybe even further ahead in certain areas with PFAS remediation and coming up with plans and stuff. So that's what I know.
Thanks, Sam, for chiming in there.
I
Go
believe
ahead,
it's
Gavin.
in the same. I believe it's in the same manner. The one, I believe it's the same as it was a little bit ago, but Wisconsin is at a voluntary basis right now. So there is no, that I know of, if this could have changed recently, but mandatory testing for PFAS. But I do know some facilities are, especially in, I know the big one in Dane County for the Madison area, they tested for it and monitor for it, and then Milwaukee as well. So I know there is some testing, but I don't think it's mandatory yet.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I know we're leaving some questions on the table here, and I'm leaving, I'm glad your contact information is also up on the screen here in case folks would like to reach out and get some more questions answered. But what I want to say to all of you, since we're at the hour, is to each of our panelists, Gavin, Lily, and Sean, thank you so much for sharing with us and giving us kind of a baseline understanding and more of what we know about PFAS right now. And I think a reality check that there's a lot more we have to learn, but that work is happening and continues to happen. So, and thank you also to the audience and for everyone for joining today. I'm going to do my best to get this recording turned around for folks who might have missed part of it or folks who weren't able to join today. I just appreciate you all being here. And with that, I'll send you all off to the rest of your day. Thank you so much.